The Vorth Clearance Board met on the 43rd floor of the academical spire, where the air was recycled through membranes that smelled faintly of burnt copper and old decisions. There were 7 of them seated at the curved obsidian table, 7 Vorth officials in their ceremonial ridge collars, the bioluminescent lines along their jaw plates flickering in the slow, rhythmic pattern that indicated collective boredom. They had been doing this for 6 hours. Species assessments, threat calibrations, the ordinary bureaucracy of an empire that had absorbed 41 civilizations without breaking a sweat. The human sat across from them on a plain metal chair. His name was Daniel Carr. He was 34 years old, originally from a mid-sized city in Ohio, and he had been brought here, to the Vorth Academical Spire on the station Calathor, because his cargo freighter had drifted into contested space during a navigation failure, and the Vorth Border Patrol had scooped him up before he could correct course. He didn't look like much. That was the first thing Assessa Prime Suvith noted in her evaluation log. She dictated in the clicking Vorth tongue, her throat flaps cycling through the phonemes with practiced efficiency. Subject presents with bilateral symmetry, soft dermal layer, no visible defensive or offensive biological structures. Endoskeletal, estimated muscular output, moderate at best. Sensory array limited to 5 primary channels, 2 of which, olfactory and auditory, appear significantly inferior to base Vorth standard. She paused, studying him. Daniel Carr was watching the bioluminescent lines on her jaw with what appeared to be mild curiosity. Not fear, not aggression, just interest, like he was watching a nature documentary. Psychological presentation, Suvith continued, suggests low anxiety response. Either the subject is chemically suppressed, cognitively impaired, or, she hesitated, her ridge collar flaring briefly. Genuinely unbothered. The Vorth classification system had 7 threat tiers. Tier 1 was reserved for species that posed existential galactic risk, world enders, reality benders, the kind of civilizations that other civilizations built religions around fearing. Tier 7 was the bottom, negligible presence, no meaningful threat vector, absorb or release at administrative discretion. The board deliberated for 11 minutes. They classified Daniel Carr, and by extension, the human species of the planet Earth, as Tier 7. Suvith stamped the clearance document with a flatter primary hand, the official seal pressing into the soft certification material with a sound like a quiet exhale. Non-threatening, the document read. Cleared for general academical access. Arena eligible for cultural exchange programming. No military flag required. She slid the clearance across the table. Daniel picked it up, looked at it, and said, "Is any of this in English?" Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. The translation implant they'd inserted behind his left ear during intake would handle language. The question hadn't really been a question anyway. She could tell from the slight uptick at the corner of his mouth. It was something else. Something the Vorth Behavioral Index didn't have a clean category for. She made a note. Subject uses language performatively. Further observation may be warranted. Then she closed the file and moved on to the next case. Daniel was escorted from the clearance chamber by a Vorth junior aide named Peth, who was young enough that his ridge collar hadn't fully calcified yet and who had clearly never processed a human before. He kept stealing glances at Daniel's hands. "You have 5, Peth said, as they walked along corridor toward the general quarters wing. 5 what? Digits, per manipulator limb. We have 4. Most species in the academical system have 4 or 6. 5 is... He clicked his throat briefly. Statistically unusual. Lucky number, Daniel said. Peth processed this. Is the number 5 considered fortunate in human culture? Not really. I was being... Daniel paused. Never mind. It was a joke. I see. Peth clearly did not see. You are comfortable here? The gravity calibration is set to... It's fine. And the clearance result, you received Tier 7. I want to assure you this is not a pejorative designation. It simply means that I'm not a threat. Daniel glanced at him sideways. Yeah, I caught that part. Does that bother you? Daniel thought about it for a moment. Genuinely thought about it. Peth noticed, rather than reflexively responding. There was a pause of maybe 4 seconds, which in Vora social exchange was a significant silence. It meant the speaker was either processing something complex or choosing their words with unusual care. "No," Daniel said finally. "It doesn't bother me." But something in the way he said it made Peth add a small notation to his daily intake log. Later that evening, in the section reserved for anomalies, human subject responded to Tier 7 classification with apparent equanimity. Recommend passive monitoring. He submitted the log, forgot about it, and went home. Calathnor's cultural exchange arena had originally been designed as a diplomatic theater, a place where newly absorbed civilizations could demonstrate their traditions, arts, and competitive practices for the edification of Vora scholars and the entertainment of Vora citizens. Over 3 centuries it had evolved, the way most things evolve when money and boredom are involved, into something rather different from its founding vision. It was still technically a cultural exchange venue. The programming still carried that designation in the official academical registry. But the audiences that packed the tiered amphitheater on event nights weren't there for edification. They were there because the arena delivered something that careful diplomatic language could never fully obscure: spectacle, competition, the electric pleasure of watching beings push against limits. The current arena director was a Vorith named Orvist, who had held the position for 19 years and who had a gift for programming that bordered on the predatory. When Orvist received Daniel Carr's clearance file, arena eligible, Tier 7 human, species classification, novel, he felt something shift pleasurably behind his ridge collar. Novel species appearances were ratings events. The audience always turned out for something new. He reviewed the human's physiological data: soft body, moderate strength, 5 digits, standard bilateral symmetry, no venom, no armor plating, no secondary nervous system, no regenerative capacity. The species' technological level was pre-interstellar. They hadn't even achieved reliable faster-than-light capability yet. Orvis pulled up the arena's current roster of cultural exchange participants and began to think about scheduling. The human wouldn't compete in anything dangerous. That wasn't how it worked. The arena's legal framework was built around demonstration, not combat. What Orvis wanted was to slot the human into a cognitive and practical challenge series, the programming strand that attracted the most scholarly viewership. Put the Tier 7 species up against some of the academical system's more intellectually demanding tasks. Document the results. Show the gap between a primitive species and a properly developed civilization. It made for compelling viewing. It always did. He sent Daniel Carr a formal arena invitation through the station's communication system, routed through Peth's administrative terminal. The invitation described the opportunity as a showcase of human cultural and practical competencies for the benefit of academical understanding. Daniel read it twice, then sent back a single response. Sure, why not? Peth delivered Daniel to the arena prep wing 3 days later, on the morning of the first scheduled event. The prep wing was where participants received briefings on the day's challenges. Daniel sat in the briefing room alongside 2 other current participants, Sali, whose species communicated through color shifts in their translucent skin and who were here demonstrating something related to mathematical art, and a being from a species Daniel's translation implant labeled simply as Dren type, quadrupedal cognate, who was asleep in the corner. A junior arena staffer gave Daniel the briefing. Today's event is the structural reasoning assessment, the staffer explained. You will be presented with a collapsed architectural system, a model of a building type used in pre-industrial Vora civilization. The challenge is to identify the failure point and propose a restoration method using only materials available in the model kit. Is this timed? Yes. You have 40 minutes. The audience will observe. Scholars will evaluate your reasoning process. And what's the comparison benchmark? What are you measuring me against? The staffer's throat flaps flickered. A Vorith expression Daniel was beginning to read as mild discomfort. The benchmark is the historical Vorith engineering standard for this structure type. Most non-Vorith participants complete between 30 and 60% of the assessment within the time limit. What do Vorith participants score? Full completion, typically in about 12 minutes. Daniel nodded slowly. And what happened with the last few non-Vorith species that did this? The Pellucid class species from Quadrant 9 completed 44%. The Orish delegation achieved 31%. Okay, Daniel said. I get the picture. He was quiet for a moment. Can I ask who watches this? The event broadcast to approximately 400,000 VOR subscribers across the station network. It's a popular educational series. Daniel looked down at the table, then back up at the staffer. 400,000 people are going to watch me do a building puzzle? Essentially, yes. He exhaled slowly through his nose. All right, he said. Let's go. The arena floor was larger than it looked from the entrance, a wide open space of pale composite material, lit from above by banded light arrays that cycled through VOR's standard illumination spectrums. The collapsed architectural model sat on a central platform, a complex interlocking structure roughly the size of a dining table, its components scattered and compressed as if some invisible force had simply pushed it inward. Daniel walked around it once before touching anything. The audience above him, rows and rows of VOR faces, the slow pulse of bioluminescence along their jaw plates creating a kind of ambient light in the amphitheater, watched him circle the model in silence. In the commentary booth, the arena's lead scholar commentator, a veteran VOR academic named Decivor, leaned toward her recording apparatus and spoke in measured tones. The human subject is exhibiting the pre-engagement survey behavior, a common response among non-VOR participants who lack intuitive familiarity with VOR architectural logic. The circular inspection pattern suggests a search for... She paused. Daniel had stopped at a specific section of the collapse model. He crouched down, not touching it yet, and tilted his head at about a 40-degree angle. A specific point of interest, Decivor continued. This is notable. Most participants begin at the largest or most visually prominent section. The human has gone directly to what appears to be the northeast load-bearing junction. That is, in fact, the primary failure point. A murmur moved through the audience. Subtle, a collective flickering of jawplate light. He hasn't been told where the failure point is, Decivor noted, her voice carrying a fraction more interest. He located it through visual analysis alone. In under 90 seconds, Daniel began working. What followed over the next 37 minutes was something the arena audience had not quite seen before, not because it was miraculous, but because it was methodical in a way that felt almost alien to watch. Daniel didn't work fast. He worked in a specific pattern. Assess, test, adjust. He would pick up a component, hold it, sometimes close his eyes briefly, then place it somewhere with precision that looked almost too careful for someone who had never seen the structure type before. He made mistakes. 3 of them, clearly visible, moments where he placed a component and then removed it and set aside what looked like quiet annoyance directed entirely inward. No frustration externalized. No visible stress response. Just a removal and restart, the same methodical pattern re-engaged. At the 37-minute mark, he set the final component. The structure stood. Not perfectly. One section was slightly off-axis, a subtle lean that a VOR engineer would correct in their sleep. But it stood, complete, all primary systems in place. Decivor stared at it. Full completion, she said, and even through the arena's audio system her voice carried something that didn't quite have a word in Vorth. Something between surprise and recalibration. The human has achieved full completion of the structural reasoning assessment in 37 minutes. She paused. The benchmark is 12. The human exceeded the time benchmark. But, another pause. No non-VOR participant has achieved full completion before. In 41 species assessments, the audience was quiet. Daniel stood back from the restore model, looked at it, looked at the slight lean in the northeastern section, and reached out and corrected it. Then he stepped back, put his hands in the pockets of his plain gray pants, and looked up at the audience. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look proud. He looked like someone who had done a thing that needed doing, and was now mildly curious about what happened next. In the commentary booth, Decivor sat back in her chair and wrote 3 words in her person notation system, not in the official broadcast log, just her own private record. Watch this one. Over the next 6 days, Daniel competed in 4 more arena events. The second was a language pattern recognition test, identifying structural grammar rules in a synthetic language designed to have no parallels to any known linguistic system. Most species got approximately 4 of the 12 rules. Daniel got 9 and correctly hypothesized the existence of the 13th rule that the designers had intentionally hidden in the architecture as a control variable. They hadn't expected anyone to find it. It had been there for 11 years. The third was a negotiation simulation, a scenario in which the participant had to broker a resource agreement between two fictional factions with incompatible value systems. Daniel didn't broker a compromise. He reframed the value systems themselves, presenting both factions with a third conceptual framework that made their incompatibility irrelevant. The simulation was designed to have no ideal outcome. It had always produced a winner and a loser. Daniel produced a draw that both sides could call a victory. The fourth was a sensory calibration challenge, navigating a complex physical space using only tactile feedback, all other sensory input blocked. Daniel was slower than the benchmark, much slower. He finished with 4 minutes to spare, and when the blindfold came off, he had a small cut on his left hand from a contact point he'd misjudged. He looked at the cut and said quietly, to no one in particular, "That's embarrassing." The fifth was a memory and pattern synthesis challenge. Recall a sequence of 400 symbolic inputs and identify the underlying generative rule. Daniel recalled 381 of the 400 inputs and identified the rule correctly. He'd missed 19. He was not perfect. He was not superhuman. The Vorth benchmark scores still beat him on speed in every event. In the sensory test, 3 other non-Vorth species in the historical record had performed better, but a pattern had emerged that was making Orvis, the arena director, deeply uneasy. He sat in his office on the evening after the 5th event, looking at the performance data. The human didn't excel in any single dimension. What the human did was not fall apart. Every other species, when pushed into an area outside their cognitive or sensory strengths, showed degradation. Their performance in subsequent events would drop, their stress indicators would spike, their engagement with the challenge would become defensive or erratic. Daniel's performance didn't degrade. Between events, it slightly improved. Not dramatically, not in a way that looked like learning the system. More like he was settling in, getting comfortable, relaxing into a space that most participants found increasingly uncomfortable the longer they were in it. Orvis pulled up the psychological monitoring data from the arena's passive sensor array, standard practice for all participants, part of the ethical oversight framework. Stress hormone analogs, whatever the human equivalent was, engagement markers, threat response indicators. Daniel Carr's threat response indicators had been declining since day one. He was calmer now than when he'd arrived. Orvis stared at this data for a long time. Then he made a call to a colleague, Dr. Valith, who ran the Academical Behavioral Research Division, and said, "I need you to watch the human's arena footage." "I've seen it," Valith said. "Everyone in behavioral research has seen it. And—" a pause. "And we're not sure what we're looking at." Dr. Valith was a kind of scholar who decorated her office with the things she couldn't explain. Most Vorth academics filled their spaces with their achievements, publications, commendations, models of confirmed theories. Valith had those too, but they were stacked in a corner. The walls were covered with notation boards, each one holding the outline of a problem she hadn't solved yet. There were 47 boards. Daniel sat across from her in the small chair she'd brought in, because her usual visitor furniture was designed for Vorth proportions and was deeply uncomfortable for humans. She'd sourced the chair from a general supply catalog and put it there before he arrived, which Daniel noticed and didn't comment on. "I want to ask you about your experience in the arena," she said. "All right. How would you describe your internal state during the events?" Daniel thought about this. The 4-second pause that Peth had noticed on his first day. It was becoming a recognizable signature. "Focus," he said. Mostly. The sensory navigation one was frustrating. I don't do well when I can't see. I got anxious. Your stress indicators showed a spike in the first 8 minutes of that event. They then dropped back to your baseline." "Yeah." He nodded. "I figured out that being anxious about not seeing wasn't to make me see. So I stopped." Valith wrote something down. "You stopped being anxious." I redirected it. Used it as fuel for the tactile attention instead. Anxiety is not useless. It makes you pay attention. I just needed it paying attention to the right thing. Valith set down her stylus. She looked at him for a moment. How old were you when you learned to do that? I didn't learn it from anyone. He paused. I had a rough stretch in my 20s. Some things went badly. I kind of developed it out of necessity. What things went badly? He met her eyes. It was a direct look, not challenging, not guarded, just level. My father died when I was 26. Then my business failed. Then I had a couple years that were just hard in ways I don't love describing to strangers. A brief pause. Then I decided to get a cargo hauling license and spend most of my time alone in space, which probably tells you something. What does it tell me? That I'm comfortable with difficulty, he said, and that I prefer my own company most of the time, and that I find problems easier to deal with than people. Valeth was quiet for a moment. Behind her, the notation boards covered in unsolved problems lined the wall in silent testimony. Mr. Carr, she said, I want to share a theory with you. I want to know if it feels accurate from the inside. Go ahead. The Vorth developmental framework, and the framework of most civilizations in the academical system, optimizes for peak performance. The goal from childhood is to identify your species' cognitive and physical strengths and maximize them, to become as excellent as possible in the areas where you are naturally capable. This produces specialists, very high peaks. She paused. But it also produces something else. When these specialists encounter a domain outside their strength, when they are placed in a context where their training doesn't apply, they experience something that we classify as functional crisis. Their identity is tied to competence in specific domains. Failure in those domains reads as existential. Daniel was listening carefully. Your species, Vela continued, does not appear to work this way. Your performance data shows no catastrophic degradation in any domain. You are not exceptional in any single area by our standards, but you are functional across all of them, and your psychological profile suggests that difficulty itself is not threatening to your sense of self. She paused, not because you don't care about failing, but because somewhere in your development, possibly cultural, possibly personal, you learn that being capable of handling difficulty is more fundamental to identity than succeeding at any particular task. The room was quiet. Is that accurate? She asked. Daniel stared at the wall of unsolved problems behind her. Then he looked back at her. Yeah, he said, that's pretty close. Can you tell me where that comes from? In human culture? He exhaled slowly. Humans have a bad history, he said. I mean, we have a good history too. Art, music, philosophy, all of that. But the foundation of most of it is difficulty, disease, war, famine, civilizations collapsing. Most human cultures that survived long enough to build anything had to develop some framework for continuing to function while things were falling apart. It's in our stories, in our religions, the whole concept of hope as a virtue. Hope is only a virtue if things are regularly bad enough that you need it. He paused. We're not good at being fine, he added. Most humans I know are better at adversity than they are at stability. That probably isn't healthy. But here, he gestured vaguely at the arena building around them. It's apparently useful. Vela picked up her stylus and turned to a fresh notation board. She didn't write a theory. She wrote a question, because that was how she worked. What happens to a civilization that optimizes for peak performance? When the context changes and peaks become valleys? Orvis had changed the schedule. He hadn't told Daniel. He'd filed a programming change as a format evolution in the arena's administrative system, which was technically within his director's discretion, and he'd clear it with the oversight board in a meeting that lasted 8 minutes because everyone was curious and nobody wanted to be the one to say wait. The sixth event was not a standard cultural exchange challenge. It was a live system failure scenario. Caliph North Station had a training simulation suite, a full-scale replica of a critical infrastructure junction, used to train Vorth engineering teams on emergency response protocols. Orvis had requested access to it, framed as a practical skills demonstration, and gotten it. The scenario was this. A power regulation cascade had failed in the simulated junction, triggering a secondary failure in the atmospheric processing system. Without intervention, the simulated station sector would lose breathable atmosphere within 90 minutes. The participant had to diagnose and address the failure using the tools available in the junction bay. This was, In the arena's history, a VOR-specific event, it had run 6 times, always with VOR participants, as a demonstration of VOR engineering excellence for diplomatic guests. No non-VOR species had ever been entered. The audience that turnout was not 400,000. It was 900,000, nearly half the station's population, watching on the network feed. Because word had gotten around, the way word gets around on any station that size. And what the word said was, "Something is happening with the human." Daniel stood in the simulation junction bay and looked at the cascade failure. Peth was in the observation gallery, which he hadn't been for the previous events. He'd watched the feeds from his administrative terminal like most station staff. But today, he'd come in person, and he was standing at the railing with his ridge collar flickering in a pattern that Vorik behavioral manuals classified as elevated anticipatory tension. He wasn't alone. The observation gallery was packed. Thesivor was in the commentary position again. She had reviewed all 6 previous events and had a 6-page private analytical memo that she hadn't published yet because she wasn't sure what to call it. She started the commentary on autopilot while watching Daniel with the whole of her attention. The participant is conducting an initial assessment. The primary cascade failure is visible in the upper junction panel, a sequence of blown regulation nodes that is propagated down into the atmospheric processing trunk. This is a 3-stage failure. VORD engineering protocol addresses each stage sequentially, beginning with the regulation nodes. Daniel was not beginning with the regulation nodes. He was crouched next to the atmospheric processing trunk, doing something that no one in the observation gallery immediately understood. He had opened a secondary access panel, not the primary maintenance panel, the secondary one, which was technically accessible but which contained only monitoring systems and had no repair interface, and he was looking at the data readout. He's reading the cascade history, Thesivor said, slowly. He's not trying to fix the failure. He is reading backward through the sequence to find the origin point. One of the Vorth engineers in the observation gallery, a senior systems tech named Brove who had helped design the training simulation, made a sound that was not quite a word. "That's the right approach," Brove said. "That is the correct approach. You cannot fully stabilize the cascade without identifying the origin, because the origin node will reflux and restart the sequence within approximately 40 minutes of any surface repair." She paused. "We teach this in second-year engineering training. The simulation is designed so that participants who perform only surface repairs will receive an apparent success followed by reflux failure. In our 6 previous runs, participants all performed surface repairs," Thesivor said. "All 6 times." "Yes." In the junction bay, Daniel had found the origin point, a single failed regulator deep in the trunk system, masked by the cascade that had originated from it. He removed it, looked at it, set it aside, and began looking for its replacement in the tool bay. There was no replacement. The simulation was designed that way. The correct part was not in the standard tool inventory. The correct Vorth engineering response was to fabricate a bridge component using 2 secondary parts in a specific configuration. Daniel looked at the tool bay for approximately 90 seconds. Then he did something that caused Brove, in the observation gallery, to grip the railing with both primary hands. He didn't build the bridge configuration. He looked at the failed regulator, then at the cascade failure, then at the atmospheric processing trunk, and he made a different choice entirely. He bypassed the regulation system at the origin point, rerouting the load path through an auxiliary channel that the simulation documentation described as non-standard and not recommended for primary use. "That's not," Brove started. "Is it wrong?" Thesivor asked. A long pause. "It's not wrong," Brove said, in a voice that sounded slightly unlike herself. "It's not optimal. The auxiliary channel will carry the load but will run hot. There will be increased energy cost and a maintenance flag that requires addressing within 72 hours. She paused again. "But it will hold. It absolutely will hold." And it was faster than the fabrication approach by approximately 20 minutes. Another pause. "I've been running the simulation for 11 years. No participant has ever used the auxiliary channel. It requires understanding the system well enough to know the auxiliary channel exists and what it can tolerate, which is not in the primary documentation. It is in the engineering schematics, the deep schematics." He read the deep schematics. He would have had access to them in the pre-event materials. I don't know if he... Brove looked down at Daniel in the Junction Bay. He read the deep schematics. Daniel completed the repair with 14 minutes remaining on the clock. He ran a diagnostic check, reviewed the output data, noted the thermal flag on the auxiliary channel, and wrote a note on the event documentation pad. Auxiliary routing, stable. Requires maintenance check within 72 hours. Not a permanent solution. Permanent solution requires sourcing the correct regulator. Part number visible on failed unit. He put down the pad and looked up at the observation gallery. 900,000 people were watching. He gave a small, slightly awkward wave. 3 days after the 6th event, Suvith, the assessor prime who had signed Daniel's Tier 7 clearance on his first day, requested a meeting, not through PETH, not through the Arena administration, directly, using her personal contact credentials, to Daniel's station quarters. Daniel opened the communication and stared at the name for a moment before replying. They met in a neutral space, one of the Spire's quiet rooms, used for sensitive diplomatic conversations and designed with a kind of careful blankness that belonged to no single culture. Bare walls, functional furniture, a window that looked out at open space. Suvith sat across from him. She was out of her ceremonial ridge collar, the formal assessment regalia, and was wearing the plain professional dress of an off-duty official. It made her look smaller. Not physically smaller, just less armored. "I signed your clearance," she said without preamble. "I know. Tier 7. Yes." She looked at him steadily. "I want to understand something. When you received that classification, when I stamped that document and handed it to you, you knew what it meant. The translation implant would have been functional by that point. Yes. And you were not angry. No. Not offended. No. Why not?" Daniel looked out the window at the stars. "Because you were doing your job," he said. "You looked at what was in front of you, and you made the most accurate assessment you could with the information you had. Tier 7 was a reasonable conclusion, given what you knew about humans at the time." He paused. Being angry at someone for not knowing something they had no way of knowing isn't useful. It's just vanity. Suvith was quiet for a moment. Most species that receive Tier 7 react with either distress or aggression. "I'm sure they do." You reacted with mild curiosity about what would happen next. She studied him. "Is that a human trait? That forward orientation?" "It's a me trait, maybe." He considered. "Some humans are very interested in how they're perceived. I used to be. I spent a lot of years worrying about whether people thought well of me. After a while it became clear that it was costing more than it was worth." He paused. "I'm not indifferent to it, but I don't run on it." Suvith was silent for a long moment. Outside the window, a supply freighter drifted past on its approach vector. "I want to change your classification," she said. Daniel looked at her. "Okay. Not because of the Arena performance. That's Orvis' domain, and it has its own politics." She paused. "Because my job is accurate assessment, and the Tier 7 classification was based on a framework that measures threat in terms of physical capability, technological level, and species population density in active space." She paused again. "It does not have a category for what you represent." "What do I represent?" She didn't answer immediately. When she spoke, the words came out with a carefulness that suggested she had not quite formalized a thought yet. She was building it as she spoke. "Our system has been absorbing civilizations for 300 years, she said. "Every species we have absorbed has had a profile, a specific set of strengths and a specific set of vulnerabilities. We identify both. We catalog them. We build relationships with absorbed civilizations around their strengths, and we design administrative structures that compensate for their vulnerabilities." She paused. "This system works. It has worked for 3 centuries. But," Daniel said, "but it assumes the profile is stable, that a species that is non-threatening at point of first contact will remain non-threatening at all subsequent contact points. That Tier 7 remains Tier 7. She looked at him. "You finished the structural reasoning assessment faster than 41 previous non-Bohr species. You found a hidden variable in a language test that had been running for 11 years. You solved an unsolvable negotiation simulation by reframing the premise. And then you solved an engineering emergency using a method that 11 years of trained Vore professionals never considered. I'm not, Daniel started. I know what you're going to say. You're going to say you weren't extraordinary. You were slow. You made errors. A Vorth engineer would have been faster. She paused. You're right, on every individual metric. You are below our benchmark. So what's the problem? The problem, Suva said, is that our system does not know what to do with someone who is below benchmark on every individual metric, and yet keeps solving problems that our system couldn't solve. We don't have a classification for that. We don't have a framework that explains it. She looked at him directly. That is what I mean when I say you don't fit in a tier. Not because you're more powerful than we thought. Because you're a different shape than any shape we have a category for. Silence. Daniel looked out at the stars. Dr. Valeth had a theory, he said. She thinks it's about how humans relate to difficulty. That we don't optimize for peak performance. We optimize for resilience. The ability to function when things go wrong. I read her memo. Then you know her actual conclusion. Suvith nodded. She believed that your species may be uniquely suited to environments of systemic disruption, where established systems fail, where the known categories stop working. A pause. She believes that a civilization that has spent millennia learning to survive collapse may have developed something that a civilization that has spent 3 centuries succeeding cannot easily replicate. She said that, in less flattering terms. Suvith allowed something that might have been a dry expression. She called your species collapse-adapted. She meant it as a biological observation. I found it philosophically unsettling. Daniel turned back from the window. And yet you want to change my classification. Yes. To what? Suvith paused. That's the problem. I don't know yet. We may need to create a new category. She paused again. That has happened twice in 300 years. Both times it changed the way we understood our own system. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer it honestly. All right. The arena, Orvis programming choices, the escalating events, the live system failure scenario. He paused. Is that normal procedure? Or was someone testing something? Suvitha's jawplate bioluminescence shifted, a pattern that Daniel's 3 weeks on the station had taught him to associate with Vorth, who was choosing precision over comfort. It was not entirely normal procedure, she said. Was it testing? Yes. For what? She met his eyes. We didn't know yet, she said. That was a problem. We were testing to find out what the question was. Word spread, the way word spreads in any system. Not through official channels, not through the academical registry, but through the informal networks that run beneath every bureaucratic structure. Messages between researchers, conversations in dining halls, a junior aide mentioning to a friend who worked in another division who mentioned to their partner who worked in communications. Something is happening with the human. By the end of Daniel's 4th week on Kalathnor, Valeth had received 14 formal requests from researchers across 6 departments asking to collaborate on her study. She accepted 4 and put the others on a waiting list. By the 5th week, 3 other stations in the Vorth network had sent inquiries to the academical spire asking for information about the human cultural exchange participant. By the 6th week, a Vorth council representative, a political figure, not an academic, had attended one of Daniel's arena events in person. Sitting in the standard audience gallery, without announcement, Daniel noticed. He noticed most things by that point, having spent 6 weeks developing a functional read of Vor's social behavior that was rough around the edges but directionally accurate. He watched the council representative watch him, and he felt something that was not quite unease. More like the particular alertness that comes when the nature of a situation begins to shift and the shift is not yet legible. After the event, a collaborative problem-solving challenge in which Daniel had been paired with a Gesali participant and had spent most of the event figuring out how to communicate with a being whose language was color and light. He found Peth in the corridor. The council representative, Daniel said, Peth's ridge collar flickered. You saw her. Why was she there? I don't. Peth. The young aide was quiet for a moment. Then, there's a situation. In the outer sectors, a system failure, A real one, not a simulation. An infrastructure collapse in the Tessivar region. It's been failing for 18 months. We've sent 7 engineering teams. They have all addressed the surface failures, and the system has reflux. Every time. Daniel was still, like the simulation. The simulation that you solved and the way you solved it was not a coincidence, Peth said quietly. Orvis designed it based on the Tessivar failure pattern. He adapted it from the actual technical data. He paused. I am sorry. I was not supposed to tell you this. But I think you deserve to understand what has been happening. Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the corridor wall. Plain composite, no decoration, just function, and breathed in once, slowly. What's in the Tessivar region? He asked. 42 million people, Peth said, across 9 station colonies. They have been on restricted atmosphere protocols for 8 months. The infrastructure is getting worse. And the 7 engineering teams couldn't fix it because they were all looking at the surface failures and not the origin. We believe so, but we don't know where the origin is. The system is large and the cascade is... Peth paused. It is very complex. It is not like the simulation. No, Daniel said. It's never like the simulation. He was quiet for another moment. The council representative is going to make an offer, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. And you came to tell me this before she did. Peth's bioluminescence shifted. A pattern Daniel had never seen on him before. Something that looked, in its structure, almost like apology. You were classified Tier 7. Peth said, I wrote a monitoring recommendation in my intake log on your first day. I have been watching you for 6 weeks, and he stopped. You are not what we thought you were. And I wanted you to know what you were walking into before you walked into it. Daniel looked at the young aide for a long moment. Thank you, he said. You're not angry? No. A pause. You did your job too. You all did your jobs. That's not something to be angry about. He paused again. The monitoring, the arena, the escalating tests, none of that was cruel. You were trying to understand something you hadn't seen before. That's the right response to encountering something you don't understand. What is the wrong response? Peth asked. Daniel looked at him. Assuming you already know what it is before you look. The council representative's name was Orville, and she met Daniel the following morning in the Spire's formal reception hall, a significant upgrade from a neutral quiet room of his previous conversations, which told him something about how the conversation had been positioned internally. She was direct. Daniel appreciated that. The Tessivar situation, she said. We need a different perspective. We have applied our best engineering expertise for 18 months, and the system continues to fail. We have reviewed Dr. Valeta's research. We have reviewed your arena performance data, and we have a proposal. I'm listening. We would like you to go to Tessivar, not as an engineer. You are not an engineer. As an observer and an analyst, you will be given full access to the system documentation and full access to the infrastructure itself. You will work alongside our engineering teams, and you will tell us what you see that we are not seeing. Daniel thought about it. I want 2 things, he said. Name them. I want Dr. Valeth with me. Her research perspective is relevant, and I trust her thinking. Orville nodded. Agreed. And I want it understood, in writing formally, that I am not a solution. I am a perspective. I might look at this system and see something useful. I might also look at it and see nothing that your engineers haven't already seen. I will not be held responsible for an outcome that depends on factors no single person can control. He paused. 42 million people are involved. I want realistic expectations on record before I go anywhere near it. Orville studied him. Most beings, when offered this kind of opportunity, focus on what they stand to gain. I know what I stand to gain, Daniel said. I want to make sure everyone is clear on what this isn't. There was a pause. You'll have your documentation, Orville said. The Tessivar region was 6 days of transit from Calathnor on a Vorth Council transport that was faster and considerably more comfortable than Daniel's cargo freighter. He spent most of the journey reading. The engineering schematics were dense, and he was not an engineer. He had to build his understanding from a conceptual level down, using the system logic as a skeleton and the technical data as flesh over it. Vela sat across from him for large portions of the journey, watching him read and occasionally asking questions that helped her map the shape of his thinking process. "You keep going back to the same section," she said on the fourth day. "The atmospheric processing trunk architecture." He set the document down. "It's the same fundamental design as a simulation. Different scale, more complex, but the same philosophy. Centralized regulation with a primary trunk and auxiliary channels designed as backup, not primary load-bearing. That's standard Vorth infrastructure design. It's been standard for 2 centuries. I know." He paused. "It's a design that works very well when the system is operating within its original parameters. It assumes a relatively stable environment with defined load ranges. And Tessevar's load has exceeded those parameters. The population grew faster than projected. The system is carrying about 40% more load than it was designed for." He paused. "That's not the origin failure. That's the context. The origin failure is somewhere in the trunk. The same issue as the simulation, a failed regulation component that's causing the cascade. But the reason it can't be fixed by conventional repair is that the system is running so hot that any new regulation component installed at the origin point will fail again within weeks. You're not fixing the origin failure. You're replacing it." Valeth was very still. "You got this from the schematics?" "From the repair logs, mostly. 7 teams, 18 months of documented repairs. Every team replaced components at the origin point. They identified it or close to it, and every team's repairs lasted between 3 and 11 weeks before failing again." He paused. "The engineers weren't making mistakes. They were applying the correct fix to the wrong problem. The problem isn't the failed component. The problem is the environment the component is operating in. So the solution is redistribute the load." He spread his hands. "Take the weight off the primary trunk. Bring the auxiliary channels up to primary load-bearing status, not as a temporary bridge, like I did in the simulation, but as a permanent architectural change. Split the load across 4 parallel systems instead of 1 central system. The trunk won't fail if it's not carrying weight it was never designed to carry." Valeth stared at him. "That's a major infrastructure redesign," she said. "That would take months, probably, and it would need to be done in phases while the system is still running, which is complicated." He paused. "But it's not impossible, and it's the actual solution. Everything else is buying time. The engineering teams didn't. The engineering teams were solving the failure," Daniel said. "They weren't asking why the failure keeps happening. Those are different problems." He paused. "This is the thing about having a defined expertise. You get very good at solving the problems you're trained to see, but the training shapes what you look for. I'm not trained in Vorth infrastructure engineering. I had no idea what I was looking for. I just followed the data." He picked up the schematics again. Valeth sat back in her chair. She looked out the transport window at the stars passing in the slow drift of regular space travel. She thought about her notation boards, the 47 problems she couldn't solve, hanging on her office walls. She thought about the questions she'd written after her first conversation with Daniel. What happens to a civilization that optimizes for peak performance when the context changes and peaks become valleys? She thought about the answer that she was beginning to see taking shape. A civilization that optimizes for peaks becomes extraordinary at what it knows how to do. And when the context changes, when the system shifts beyond its design parameters, when the familiar failures stop responding to familiar solutions, a civilization of peaks will send its best people to solve the problem, and those best people will apply the best solutions they know, and the problem will keep happening, because the best solutions they know were built for a different context. She thought about Daniel Carr from Ohio, who had lost his father in his business and had spent years alone in space getting comfortable with difficulty, and who had read 11 years of repair logs and followed the data to a conclusion that 7 teams of experts had missed not because they were less intelligent, but because their expertise had shaped the problem into a form their expertise could solve. She thought about what it meant that the Vorth academical system, 300 years of successful civilization building, 41 absorbed species, an empire of extraordinary peaks, had needed a Tier 7 human to look at their broken infrastructure and ask why does it keep failing instead of how do we fix it? And she thought, quietly, that this might be the most important research she ever did, not because of what it said about humans, but because of what it said about what expertise does to a system, what any system does to itself when it becomes so successful that it stops being able to see the shape of the problems it wasn't designed for. The test of our infrastructure redesign began 4 months after Daniel Carr's analysis. It took 8 months to complete, carried out in phases by the same Vorth engineering teams who have been unable to solve it for 18 months, because the solution, once identified, was absolutely within their engineering capability. It had never been a capability problem. It had been a framing problem. The system stabilized. The atmosphere restrictions lifted. 42 million people stopped living on rationed air. Daniel was present for the final phase completion. He stood in the primary junction bay of the Tessevar Central Hub, watching the load distribution data on the monitoring panel, and he watched the numbers settle into their new normal. For parallel systems, each carrying a manageable share of the weight, none of them strained to breaking. A senior Vorth engineer named Kassoff, who had been part of the original repair teams and who had worked the redesign with a dedicated intensity that bordered on personal atonement, stood beside him and looked at the same panel. "I want to understand," Kassoff said, "the auxiliary channels, the load redistribution. It is not a complex concept. I have known about auxiliary channels since my 2nd year of training. Why did I not see it?" Daniel thought about this carefully, because it was a real question and deserved a real answer. "Because you were looking at a failure," he said. "And when you're looking at a failure, your whole attention goes to the failed thing. What broke, why it broke, how to fix it. That's the right focus for most failures. It works 99 times out of 100. He paused. The 100th time, the failure is a symptom. And when you're looking at the symptom, the cause is in your peripheral vision. Technically visible, but not what your attention has been trained to center." Kassoff was quiet. "And you were not trained to center the failure. I wasn't trained in any of this. I had no center." Daniel paused. "I just followed the data until it told me something." Kassoff looked at the monitoring panel, at the 4 clean lines of distributed load, steady and sustainable. "Veilitha's research will change the way we train engineers," she said. "Not just engineers, assessors, administrators. The framework question, why does it keep failing instead of how we fix it? It seems simple when you say it. Most important questions do. It's not simple to learn. We have 300 years of pattern that says fix the failure, retrain the attention. That is a generation of work." She paused. "Maybe more. Probably more," Daniel agreed. They stood together in the junction bay for a while, watching the numbers. Outside, through the thick composite walls, 42 million people were breathing normally for the first time in 8 months. Daniel's formal classification was changed, officially, 7 months after the Tessevar stabilization. Suvith signed it herself. The new designation, created as a 3rd novel classification in 300 years of Vorth academical history, read, Adaptive Resonance Presence. Species designation, human. Classification basis, cross-domain functional stability under conditions of systemic disruption. No established threat vector. No established ceiling vector. Ongoing assessment recommended. She sent a copy to Daniel through Peth's administrative terminal. Daniel read it, sitting in his quarters on Caliph Nor, where he had been offered a research consultancy position that he was still deciding whether to take. The cargo freighter was repaired. His navigation license was still valid. The stars were still out there. He read the new classification twice. Then he sent back a message to Suvith. 3 words through the official channel. Still not threatening. Suvith received the message in her office. Her ridge collar flickered. The bioluminescent pattern that an outside observer would have needed to know her well to read correctly. It was the Vorth equivalent of a smile. In her office in the Behavioral Research Division, Dr. Veilith stood in front of her 47 notation boards. She looked at them for a long time. Then she walked to the 47th board, the newest one, added 6 months ago, and read the question she had written there. What happens to a civilization that optimizes for peak performance when the context changes and peaks become valleys? She picked up her stylus. She wrote, beneath it, it finds something that doesn't have a peak and learns to ask why. She capped the stylus and set it on her desk. Outside the window, Caliph Noor turned slowly in the dark, full of people doing their jobs, solving the failures in front of them, building the best civilizations they knew how to build. It was good work, important work. The peaks were real. The question was just, what do you do with the space between them? That was new work, and it was just beginning.